The first time Jonah Reed drove past White Ridge, he did not see a farm.
Dead, frozen
He saw
rock.
a pale hillside scattered with
I told
stones,
you there's nothing but
thorny
stone.
shrubs and patches of grass, so thin that the earth showed through them. The property rose sharply from the county road, then stretched toward a line of crooked oak trees near the northern boundary. Nothing about it resembled the farms Jonah had worked on all his life. There were no dark fields waiting for seed, no level ground for machinery, no irrigation pond reflecting the sky. Even the fence looked temporary,
Cross is right here.
as if the previous owner
Right
had
under
never
the
believed
oaks.
the land was
Right
worth
under the
protecting.
oaks.
A faded wooden
Looking
sign
for
stood
50.
beside the gate.
Who will give me 50?
58
I
acres
will
for
bid
sale.
$50.
The price had been crossed out twice. Jonah
I have
slowed his
50.
truck but did not
50.
stop.
Do I hear 60?
He had spent 23
This
years
limestone
farming land that
reveals a
belonged
lot
to
about
other
your
men.
land.
First
The
with his
northern
father,
slope is where you'll find
then
the
as a
rich
tenant
soil.
on the Caldwell farm
With the
west
right
of town.
care, this vineyard
He had
will
planted
thrive.
wheat, cut hay, and repaired machinery he would never own. That arrangement had ended 3 months earlier, when the Caldwell family sold their property to a development company. Jonah received 30 days to remove his equipment. By the time he paid his debts and sold what he could not store, he had enough money to buy a small house or a bad piece of farmland. He chose the bad farmland. 2 weeks after first seeing White Ridge, Jonah attended
can't
the
do
county
this
auction.
anymore.
Only 6 people came. Walter Shaw, who owned the neighboring farm, stood near the front with his arms folded. His family had planted wheat on the lower section of White Ridge 12 years earlier. The crop grew unevenly, yellowed before maturity, and produced barely enough grain to cover the cost of harvesting. The next owner tried hay. Most of it never reached knee height. After that, the land became grazing ground for a few goats. Even they were removed when the shallow well failed during a dry summer. The auctioneer described the property carefully: 58 acres of marginal agricultural ground, thin soil over limestone, limited water access, previous cropping history available upon request. A man behind Jonah whispered, "That means nothing grows there." Walter heard him and smiled. The opening price was less than half the value of the smallest
finally
productive
did it,
farm in the
boy.
county. No one bid. The auctioneer lowered it. Jonah raised his hand. Several people turned toward him. Walter stepped closer. "You planning to build a house up there?" "I'm planning to farm it." The man behind Jonah laughed. Walter studied Jonah's face, waiting for the joke. When it did not come, he said, "My family tried that ground. You can't pull a crop out of stone." Jonah looked toward the auctioneer. "Maybe not the crop you planted." Walter's smile disappeared. No one challenged Jonah's bid. The hammer fell after less than 3 minutes. For the price of a new tractor, Jonah became the owner of 58 acres that no one else wanted. The next morning, he parked inside the broken gate with a shovel, a notebook, and a steel bucket. He began near the road. The first strike of the shovel produced a sharp metallic sound. The blade had hit stone less than 3 inches below the surface. Jonah moved several feet and tried again. Another stone. On the third attempt, he managed to remove a shallow block of soil. It was pale brown, dry and filled with white fragments. There was little organic material and almost no visible root structure. He rubbed the soil between his fingers. Fine powder coated his skin. Walter had been right about one thing. This was not ordinary farmland. By noon, Jonah had dug 20 test holes across the lower slope. Most confirmed the same problem: thin soil, stones, and rapid drainage. Water poured into the holes disappeared almost immediately. A crop with shallow roots would dry quickly. Heavy machinery would struggle. A high-yield grain operation made no sense. Walter stopped beside the fence while Jonah was kneeling over another hole. "Find anything valuable?" "Mostly rocks." "I could have told you that for free." Jonah lifted a white stone from the bucket. It was softer than the dark fieldstone common in the area. When he scraped it with his knife, pale powder collected along the blade. "What kind of stone is this?" he asked. "Useless stone. That isn't a kind." Walter leaned against the fence. "Limestone." "Probably. There's a strip of it running through the ridge. Makes the ground too shallow and dry." Jonah placed the stone in his pocket. "What grows well here without anyone planting it?" Walter glanced across the hillside. Brush. What about those? Jonah pointed toward the oak trees along the northern boundary. The trees were not large, but they appeared healthy. Their leaves remained deep green despite weeks of limited rain. Beneath them, the ground was almost bare except for scattered moss and short grass. Walter shrugged. Oaks grow anywhere. No, they don't. Walter laughed again. You didn't buy an oak forest. You bought 58 acres where wheat, corn, and hay already failed. Then he returned to his truck. Jonah continued uphill. The soil became even thinner as the slope rose, yet the oak trees remained. Their roots disappeared between rocks that seemed incapable of supporting anything useful. Near the largest tree, Jonah noticed a rough circle where the grass grew more sparsely than it did beyond the branches. He knelt and removed the top layer carefully. The soil underneath was loose and crumbly. Fine roots crossed through it, mixed with pale threads, too small for him to identify Lidum and Greet. Jonah did not know what they were. He only knew the ground beneath the oak behaved differently from the open hillside. He marked the spot in his notebook. Northern oak healthy despite dry soil. Sparse vegetation beneath canopy. Fine material around roots. Near sunset, he climbed to the highest point of the property. From there, he could see Walter's farm below. Long green fields, straight planting rows and machinery moving over deep soil. White ridge looked poor beside it. Uneven, stony, empty. Jonah understood why everyone had rejected it. If measured by the crops grown in the valley, the land had little value. But those crops were not the only things capable of growing. He removed the limestone fragment from his pocket and looked at the oaks once more. The question was no longer whether White Ridge could support wheat or corn. That question had already been answered. Jonah opened his notebook and wrote, "Stop asking why ordinary crops failed. Find out why the oaks survived." Below him, Walter's tractor crossed another straight row. On White Ridge, nothing moved except the leaves. Everyone saw a hillside that rejected farming. Jonah saw land that might have been judged by the wrong harvest. For the next week, Jonah did not plant anything. He walked White Ridge from one boundary to the other, marking trees, slopes, exposed stone, and places where rain disappeared fastest. The property looked simple from the road, but the closer he studied it, the less uniform it became. The lower slope carried the deepest soil, though even there the ground was thin compared with the valley farms. Higher up, white stone broke through the surface in long bands. Water vanished quickly in those areas, slipping through cracks before it could pool. Yet the oaks along the northern boundary remained healthy. That contradiction kept pulling Jonah back. Every afternoon, he dug beneath a different tree. The open ground was hard and dry. Beneath the oaks, the soil was cooler and easier to break apart. Fine roots spread through narrow spaces between stones. In several places, Jonah found pale threads clinging to the roots like delicate fibers. He collected samples in paper bags and labeled each one. Open slope, oak edge. Under canopy, white stone band. He did not know enough to interpret the threads, but he knew they were not ordinary roots. On the fourth day, a short storm crossed the ridge. The rain lasted less than 20 minutes. Jonah stood beneath the roof of the equipment shed and watched water strike the hillside. On Walter Shaw's lower field, runoff gathered between the straight planting rows. On White Ridge, most of the rain disappeared almost as soon as it landed. At first, that looked like another weakness. Then Jonah noticed the ground beneath the oaks darkened evenly without becoming muddy. Water entered quickly, but the tree canopy and leaf litter slowed evaporation. The soil there remained damp long after the exposed slope had dried again. He pressed his hand into the ground. The surface was cool. Around the trunk, the sparse ring of grass looked sharper after the rain. Outside the ring, ordinary plants grew more densely. Inside it, only a few low species survived. Jonah marked the circle with 4 wooden stakes. The following morning, Walter stopped at the gate. You still studying the rocks? I'm studying where the water goes. It goes down. Exactly. Walter frowned. That's why the land is bad. It can't hold moisture. Jonah pointed toward the oak line. Then why are those trees green? Deep roots. And what are the roots reaching? Walter looked toward the ridge. More rock. Jonah lifted one of the sample bags. Something is helping them. Walter laughed. You bought land? Now you're trying to convince yourself it came with a mystery. Jonah did not answer. Walter's criticism was fairer than he knew. Jonah had spent nearly all his savings on White Ridge. It would have been easy to turn every strange detail into proof that the purchase had been wise. That was why he recorded failures as carefully as promising signs. Several young oaks on the eastern side were weak. Some had dead branches. 2 showed signs of insect damage. The grass rings did not appear beneath every tree. In a few places, the soil under the canopy was almost as dry as the open slope. The pattern was real, but incomplete. Jonah needed more than hope. He drove to the county office and asked for soil records, geological maps, and any older surveys of the ridge. The clerk brought him a thick folder containing agricultural classifications. Most of the pages repeated what he already knew. Thin topsoil, high stone content, low water holding capacity, poor suitability for row crops. One sentence appeared in several reports: severe limitations for conventional cultivation. Jonah almost closed the folder. Then he found a geological map. A narrow strip crossed the northern half of White Ridge and continued beneath 2 neighboring properties. It was labeled as a shallow limestone formation. The valley farms below were different. Their deeper soils had developed from transported sediments and clay-rich material. White Ridge sat directly above fractured limestone. Jonah traced the line with his finger. It passed through the healthiest oak stand. Does limestone make the soil alkaline? He asked. The clerk shrugged. Usually more than the valley ground. You'd need testing. Has anyone tested this parcel by zone? Probably not. Most owners request 1 composite sample. 1 mixed sample for 58 uneven acres. Jonah thought about the difference between the lower slope, the exposed ridge, and the soil beneath the oaks. Combining them would create a number that belonged to no single place. He paid for copies of the maps and drove to a small agricultural laboratory outside town. The technician agreed to test the samples separately. 3 days later, Jonah returned for the results. The open lower slope was mildly alkaline. The white stone band tested higher. The soil beneath the healthiest oaks was higher still, but it also contained more organic material and better structure than the exposed ground. What does that mean? Jonah asked. It means the oak areas are biologically more active. The technician said, leaf litter helps? Roots help. Fungal relationships may help too. Jonah placed the bag containing the pale threads on the counter. Could this be fungus? The technician examined it under a small lens. Possibly mycorrhizal growth. I can't identify a species from this sample. What does it do? Some fungi live with tree roots. The tree provides sugars. The fungus helps the roots access water and nutrients through a much larger network in the soil. Jonah looked at the pale fibers again. The oaks were not surviving alone. Their roots were part of a system hidden beneath the stones. Is that common? He asked. The relationship is common. The exact fungi vary. Could any of them have value? The technician paused. Some do, but don't jump ahead. Finding fungal threads doesn't mean you found anything marketable. Jonah nodded. He had no intention of announcing a discovery. Not yet. Back at White Ridge, he returned to the largest oak and knelt inside the sparse ring. The land had been judged by what failed above the surface: wheat, hay, and shallow-rooted crops. But beneath the oak, another kind of agriculture was already taking place. Roots exchanged sugars with fungi. Water moved through fractured limestone. The tree survived where ordinary crops could not. Jonah still did not know what the system could produce. He only knew the stones were not empty obstacles. They shaped drainage. They influenced soil chemistry. They created conditions different from every farm below. At sunset, Jonah opened his notebook and wrote, "The ridge is not poor valley soil. It is a different kind of land entirely." Then, beneath it, he added, "Find the crop that needs what everyone else calls a flaw." Jonah returned to the county records office with a sharper question. He was no longer trying to prove that White Ridge was good farmland. The old reports had already shown that it was not. He wanted to know what the land had been before people tried to farm it like the valley. The clerk brought out a box of older maps stored in the basement. Most showed property boundaries, road changes and water lines. One map, drawn nearly 70 years earlier, marked the ridge in pale gray instead of brown. A handwritten note beside it read, "Shallow calcareous soil over fractured limestone." Jonah copied the phrase into his notebook. The map also showed that the limestone band extended beneath the healthiest oak trees, then narrowed toward Walter Shaw's property. The lower southern slope was different. There, deeper sediment had collected over time, creating soil that could support ordinary crops for a few seasons before nutrients and moisture became limiting. The ridge itself had never truly been cropland. It had only been treated like cropland. Jonah took the map to Dr. Evelyn Price, a retired soil scientist who lived 20 miles away. She had spent much of her career studying difficult agricultural ground and now consulted occasionally for local landowners. She met Jonah beside the gate at White Ridge. Before looking at the paperwork, she walked uphill. She picked up several stones, broke one with a small hammer, and examined the fresh surface. Then she dug beneath the leaf litter near the healthiest oak. "You have limestone close to the surface," she said. "I know. Knowing the rock is here is not the same as knowing what it does." She pointed toward the slope. Limestone influences the soil's chemistry. It can raise pH and increase calcium. But this land also drains quickly because the soil is thin and the rock is fractured. So it is too dry. For many crops. Yes. Jonah showed her the laboratory results and the samples containing pale fungal threads. She studied them carefully. These oaks are surviving because they are adapted to the site. Deep roots, efficient water use and fungal partnerships all help. Could the fungi be valuable? Evelyn looked at him. "You are thinking about truffles." It was not a question. Jonah had first heard the word from the laboratory technician, then read everything he could find. He knew only the basics. Certain truffles formed underground relationships with the roots of host trees, especially oaks and hazelnuts. Some valuable species preferred alkaline, well-drained soil with limestone. White Ridge seemed to offer all three. "That is what I am wondering," Jonah said. Evelyn folded the map. "Suitable soil does not guarantee truffles." "I understand. Climate matters. Rainfall matters. Summer temperature matters. Soil depth matters. The tree stock matters. The fungal inoculation matters. Contamination by competing fungi matters." Jonah waited. "And even when everything looks right," she continued, "you may wait years and harvest nothing. So it is possible." "It is possible." That word changed the field. "Not safe." "Not certain." "Possible." Evelyn tested several parts of the ridge. She rejected the lowest section because the soil was too different and likely to remain wetter after heavy rain. She dismissed the highest exposed crest because the soil was too shallow for young trees to establish easily. The most promising ground lay along the northern slope, below the existing oak stand. There, the soil remained alkaline. The limestone was fractured rather than solid, and the slope allowed water to drain without disappearing instantly. Evelyn marked a rough area of 8 acres. "If someone wanted to attempt a truffle orchard," she said, "this is where I would investigate further." Jonah looked across the marked ground. 8 acres. The rest of the property might never support the same system. That limitation made the idea feel more credible. Walter Shaw arrived while Evelyn was packing her tools. "What are you testing now?" he asked. "Site suitability." Jonah said. "For what?" Jonah hesitated. He knew the idea would sound absurd before it sounded promising. "Truffles." Walter stared at him. Then he laughed so hard, He had to place one hand on the fence. You mean those mushrooms? Rich people shave over food? They grow underground. Not here. Why not? Because this is Bellwether County, not France. Evelyn stepped between them. Some cultivated truffle systems have been attempted outside their traditional regions. Walter looked at her. Attempted? That is the honest word. He turned back to Jonah. You bought land that cannot grow wheat? So now you plan to grow something nobody can even see. Jonah said nothing. Walter continued. How long before you know whether it works? Years. Walter smiled. That is convenient? You can fail for a long time before admitting it. After he left, Evelyn looked at Jonah. He is not completely wrong. I know. You could spend years building a system and discover the climate is not reliable enough. Or the orchard could establish and never produce marketable truffles. Then why keep studying it? Because your land has qualities that ordinary farming sees as weaknesses. Thin alkaline soil, limestone, fast drainage, existing oak adaptation. She paused. The question is whether those qualities can be assembled into a productive system. Jonah looked toward the oak trees. For the first time, he understood that White Ridge's value would not come from a hidden object already waiting beneath the ground. It would come from matching geology, biology, and patience. The stone would shape the soil. The soil would support the tree. The tree would feed the fungus. The fungus might one day produce the harvest. Nothing could be separated from the rest. Jonah returned to the records office the following day and requested every document available on rainfall, summer temperatures, and land use history near the ridge. The numbers were imperfect. Some years were too dry. Some winters were colder than ideal. But the range did not eliminate the possibility. He drew a line around the 8-acre northern slope. Then he wrote 3 words beside it. Trial. Not promise. That evening, the sunlight turned the exposed limestone almost white. Walter's green fields stretched across the valley below, productive and familiar. White Ridge remained stony, uneven, and mostly empty. But Jonah no longer compared it with the farms below. He compared it with the conditions a different crop required. The county report had called the land severely limited. It was correct. The mistake was assuming limitations had only one meaning. Jonah opened his notebook and wrote, the land was not hiding a crop. It was hiding a set of conditions no one nearby had thought to use. Jonah first heard the full explanation from a nursery owner named Samuel Vale. Samuel had spent years supplying oak and hazelnut trees to experimental orchards. He did not sell Jonah a dream. He began with warnings. Truffles are not planted like potatoes, he said. You do not bury one and wait for more. He lifted a young oak from a container and exposed part of the root ball. The fungus lives with the roots. The tree gives it sugars made from sunlight. The fungus extends through the soil and helps the tree reach water and minerals. Under the right conditions, that partnership can eventually produce truffles underground. Jonah studied the fine roots. So the tree is not just shade. It is half the system. And the soil is the other half? Not exactly. Soil, climate, water, tree health, competing fungi, management, and time. Miss one badly enough, and the whole system can fail. Samuel showed him 2 young trees that looked almost identical. One had been inoculated with a desired truffle fungus under controlled conditions. The other had not. To Jonah's eye, there was no visible difference. That unsettled him. Everything important about the project seemed hidden. The fungus lived on roots he could not see without testing. The future harvest would form beneath the soil. The first meaningful result might not appear for years. You could care for the trees correctly and still get nothing? Jonah asked. Yes. You could also get truffles? Yes. Samuel folded his arms. If you need certainty, grow something else. Jonah returned to White Ridge with a price list and a set of technical notes. The numbers were worse than he expected. Certified inoculated trees cost far more than ordinary nursery stock. A proper trial required soil preparation, irrigation, fencing, weed control, and years of maintenance before any possible return. He did not have enough money for 8 acres. He barely had enough for 2. That night, Jonah spread the papers across his kitchen table. He calculated the cost 3 times and reached the same answer. To begin, he would have to sell his old tractor. It was the last valuable machine he owned. The next morning, Walter saw the equipment dealer loading it onto a trailer. "You selling out already?" Walter asked. "Changing tools." "For what?" "Trees." Walter looked toward White Ridge. "You sold a tractor to plant oak trees on a rock hill? Not just oak trees." Walter laughed. Jonah, let him. The tractor had been useful for farming flat ground in straight rows. White Ridge did not need that kind of machine. The first orchard would be small enough to manage with rented equipment and hand tools. The sale paid for several hundred inoculated oak and hazelnut saplings, a basic irrigation system and fencing to keep deer away. Jonah planted only on the northern slope Evelyn had marked. He spaced the trees carefully, leaving enough room for roots. Sunlight and future pruning. The rows followed the contour rather than cutting directly up the hill. Walter watched from the neighboring property. "They're crooked," he shouted. "The hill is crooked. Rows should be straight. Water does not care." Jonah dug each planting hole wider than the root ball, but avoided burying the young trees too deeply. He kept heavy compost away from the root zone because he did not want to alter the soil chemistry more than necessary. That surprised Walter even more. "You spent all that money on trees and won't fertilize them?" "I'm not trying to grow the biggest oak trees in the county." "What are you trying to grow?" Jonah looked at the soil. The right relationship. The first summer nearly broke the project. White Ridge drained exactly as the reports had warned. Water moved through the shallow soil quickly, especially around the highest rows. Several hazelnuts wilted before Jonah adjusted the irrigation lines. Then a valve failed during a hot week. By the time he discovered it, 12 trees had died. He replaced them, but the loss frightened him. If a minor equipment failure could destroy years of work before the system even established, the risk was greater than he had admitted. He began checking every line at sunrise and sunset. He measured moisture by hand. He kept grass cleared from the immediate root zones to reduce competition for water. He recorded which trees recovered after heat and which remained weak. By autumn, most had survived. Nothing about the orchard looked valuable. The trees were small. The ground remained stony. There was no harvest, no income, and no visible sign that the inoculated fungus had persisted. At the diner, Walter told people Jonah had created the most expensive shade garden in the county. Jonah did not argue. The criticism was accurate from the surface. The following spring, Samuel returned to inspect the orchard. He selected several trees, removed small root samples, and examined them with a hand lens. Some showed promising colonization. Others did not. A few roots appeared to carry competing fungi. "Is that bad?" Jonah asked. "It can be." "Can I fix it?" "Not directly. You manage the orchard, so the desired fungus has the best chance, but this is not a system you control completely." Samuel marked the weakest trees for replacement. Jonah looked across the rows. He had assumed the main challenge would be keeping trees alive. Now he understood that healthy trees alone were not enough. He could grow an attractive orchard and still fail to produce a single truffle. The true crop depended on an invisible biological partnership continuing beneath the ground. That evening, Jonah walked the rows as the sun dropped behind the ridge. The young oaks cast almost no shadow. The hazelnuts barely reached his waist. Below him, Walter's wheat field moved in the wind, already promising a harvest within months. Jonah's land promised nothing. That was what made the decision difficult. He was not waiting for trees to grow. He was waiting to learn whether the soil, roots, and fungus had accepted one another. At the end of the last row, Jonah opened his notebook and wrote, "The most important crop on White Ridge may spend years growing where no one can see it." Jonah entered Bellwether Community Bank, carrying a folder thick with soil reports, orchard maps and invoices from Samuel's nursery. Martin Hale, the loan officer, Look through the documents slowly. You want to borrow against White Ridge? I want to expand the trial. How much income has the orchard produced? None yet? Martin stopped turning pages. When do you expect income? Best case. Several years. And worst case? Jonah held his gaze. Nothing. Martin closed the folder. That is the problem. Jonah explained the limestone, the alkaline soil, the healthy oak stand, and the root samples showing that some of the inoculated fungi had survived. He showed photographs of the young trees and the northern slope marked into management zones. Martin listened, but the answer did not change. The bank could value standing timber, equipment, livestock, or a crop contract. It could not easily value an underground harvest that might never appear. You are asking us to finance possibility, Martin said. All farming is possibility. Most farmers harvest within a season. Most farmers are not building this kind of system. That makes it riskier, not safer. Jonah left without the loan. By the time he reached the diner, Walter already knew. I told you, Walter said from the counter. Banks lend money to farms, not experiments. Jonah ordered coffee and sat at the far end. Walter continued. You still have time to plant something useful on the lower slope. Hi. Maybe. Goats. Anything that pays before you are too old to enjoy it. The lower slope will have a purpose. What purpose? I have not decided yet. Walter smiled. That means none. Jonah did not answer. The rejection forced him to reduce the orchard again. Instead of planting the remaining 6 acres at once, he divided expansion into small blocks. Each block would be added only after the previous one survived and showed healthy roots. It was slower, but it protected him from one large failure. He took seasonal work repairing fences and pruning orchards elsewhere in the county. The income paid for replacement trees, irrigation parts, and testing. Every dollar went back into White Ridge. The second year brought a different problem. Jonah had planted some of the first trees too closely. He had assumed more host trees would create more opportunities for the fungus. Instead, the young trees began competing for limited moisture. The hazelnuts suffered first. Their leaves curled during hot afternoons, and growth slowed in the densest rows. Several trees survived but remained weak. Samuel visited and shook his head. You planned for the number of trees you could fit, he said, not for the amount of water the slope could support. Jonah looked at the tight rows. What do I remove? The weakest trees. Then you widen the gaps before the roots compete harder. Removing living trees felt worse than replacing dead ones. Each had cost money. Each represented years of possible growth. But leaving all of them would endanger the entire block. Jonah cut 32 trees. Walter saw the pile beside the gate, planting and cutting them down in the same year. He called, "That is efficient." Jonah kept working. The next adjustment involved water. His original irrigation line delivered the same amount to each row, but the highest ground dried faster, while the lower edge remained wet after longer runs. Jonah divided the system into separate zones. The upper rows received smaller, more frequent applications. The lower rows received less. He checked the soil before every cycle instead of relying only on a schedule. The changes reduced water stress, but they also increased the work. Every valve, line, and tree had to be monitored. The orchard was becoming less like a field and more like a collection of small conditions. That was the lesson White Ridge kept teaching him. A single plan could not be applied everywhere. By the third season, the surviving trees looked stronger. The oaks had developed thicker stems, and several hazelnuts began filling the spaces Jonah had opened. Still, there was nothing to sell. Some people stopped mocking him openly because the project had lasted longer than expected. Others simply treated it as a private obsession. The most difficult criticism came from Jonah himself. At night, he calculated what the land could have earned under a simpler use. Goats might have produced modest income. Firewood could have covered some taxes. Even leasing the ridge for hunting would have returned money sooner. Instead, he had chosen a system that Re-labor before revealing whether it worked. One afternoon, Samuel brought back new root test results. The strongest trees still showed the desired fungal relationship. Several others did not. Jonah placed the reports side by side. Why did it persist here and disappear there? Moisture, competing fungi, tree stress, planting stalk, maybe several things. So we still do not know enough. We know more than we did. Jonah looked across the orchard. That answer had become the foundation of the entire project. Not certainty, improved knowledge. He replaced only the worst trees. He left the strongest blocks untouched. He reduced fertilizer, avoided bringing unnecessary organic material into the root zones, and continued monitoring the soil. By the fourth year, the orchard finally appeared established. The rows followed the contour of the ridge. Young oak canopies widened. Hazelnuts filled the lower sections. The exposed limestone still showed between them, but the land no longer looked abandoned. A developer driving through the county offered Jonah more than he had paid for the entire property. The man wanted the hill for vacation cabins. Jonah refused. "You have no commercial crop?" The developer said, "Not yet." "You may never have one." "I know." The man looked around at the young trees. "Then why keep it?" Jonah turned toward the oak line. "Because the system is still alive." That evening, he opened his notebook beside the first row. The bank had refused to finance him. The trees had forced him to slow down. The water system had exposed the differences within the slope. The root tests had removed any illusion that success was guaranteed, yet the orchard remained. Jonah wrote, "The project survived because it became smaller, slower and more precise than the plan. Everyone refused to fund." By the fifth year, the orchard looked healthy enough to impress visitors. That was exactly what worried Samuel Vale. He walked slowly between the oaks, stopping beneath the thickest canopies. The trees had grown well. Their leaves were dark, their branches strong, and the rows followed the slope in clean curves. From a distance, White Ridge finally looked like success. Samuel knelt beside one of the trees and removed a small root sample. "What do you see?" Jonah asked. "A strong tree." "That sounds good. For timber? Maybe." Jonah frowned. Samuel explained that the orchard had begun favoring tree growth more than the underground relationship Jonah needed. Some trees were receiving too much water. Others had built dense shade that kept sunlight from reaching the soil. The system was becoming comfortable. Too comfortable. Jonah had spent years trying to keep the young trees alive. He had protected them from drought, cleared competing grass and adjusted irrigation whenever leaves showed stress. Now those same protections were creating a new problem. The trees no longer had to work as hard with the fungi beneath them. Samuel showed him several root samples. The desired colonization remained strong in some sections, but weaker in others. Competing fungi had appeared around a few trees. The orchard can look perfect above ground and still fail below it, Samuel said. Jonah stared down the row. That sentence unsettled him more than the bank rejection ever had. He had assumed visible growth meant the project was progressing, but the harvest he wanted would never hang from branches. It depended on conditions he could not judge by leaves alone. Samuel recommended 3 changes. Reduce irrigation, open the canopies, remove some of the richest surface material Jonah had added around the weakest trees. The first change frightened Jonah most. White Ridge had nearly killed the orchard with drought during the first summer. Reducing water felt like repeating the same mistake. But Samuel was not asking him to abandon the trees. He was asking him to stop treating every sign of stress as an emergency. Mild stress can change how roots and fungi interact, Samuel said. Too much stress kills the system. Too little can make the tree rely less on the partnership. Jonah understood the balance immediately. The orchard needed pressure, but not damage. He divided the planting into smaller irrigation zones and began extending the time between watering. He measured soil moisture at different depths rather than judging from the surface. The upper rows dried fastest. The lower rows held moisture longer. The limestone band released water differently from the deeper pockets of soil. Once again, White Ridge refused to behave as one piece of land. Jonah also began pruning. He removed lower branches and opened gaps in the densest canopies. More sunlight reached the soil. Air moved between the trees. The orchard looked thinner and less impressive. Walter Shaw noticed. "You spent years growing those branches?" He called from the fence. "Now you're cutting them off." They were shading too much ground. "I thought shade helped hold moisture." "Some shade." Walter shook his head. "There is always another reason this thing is not working." Jonah looked at the cut branches piled beside the row. Walter was trying to insult him, but the words contained some truth. There was always another adjustment. The orchard was not a machine with one correct setting. It was a living system, and every improvement changed something else. More water supported young trees but encouraged excessive growth. More organic material improved weak soil but risked altering the conditions the fungi preferred. Dense canopies protected the ground but reduced sunlight. More trees created more host roots but increased competition. Every solution carried a cost. The most painful correction came in the 6th year. A root survey showed that one entire block had lost much of the desired colonization. The trees were healthy, but the underground partnership Jonah had paid to establish was no longer dominant. Samuel advised removing the block. "All of it?" Jonah asked. "All of it. There are 80 trees." "I know. They are alive. That does not mean they are serving the orchard." Jonah spent 2 days considering alternatives. He could leave them and hope conditions changed. He could continue caring for the block because it looked productive. He could convince himself that healthy trees would eventually create the result he wanted. Instead, he cut them down. Walter watched from the road but did not joke this time. By then, even he understood the cost. Jonah removed the roots where possible, left the ground fallow, and marked the area for later replanting. The empty block became a visible scar in the orchard. It also became proof that Jonah had stopped confusing growth with progress. That autumn, Samuel returned with another set of results. The strongest sections still showed healthy root colonization. The orchard had not failed. It had simply become smaller again. Jonah stood beside the empty block. "Every year, I lose part of the plan." Samuel nodded. "That may be why the part that remains has a chance." The next season, Jonah replanted only half the removed area. He used wider spacing, less water, and no unnecessary soil amendments. The trees looked less vigorous than the original block, but their roots developed under conditions closer to the ridge's natural character. By the 7th year, the orchard covered fewer productive acres than Jonah had once imagined. It was also more precise. The best zones followed the limestone band. The weakest zones had been removed or repurposed. The irrigation system responded to slope and depth. The canopy allowed sunlight to reach the ground. Nothing was managed for appearance. One evening, Jonah walked past the first rows he had planted. The oaks were now tall enough to cast long shadows across the stone. He could still see gaps where trees had died, been removed or failed below ground. The orchard no longer resembled the perfect plan he had drawn years earlier. It resembled the land. Jonah opened his notebook and wrote, "White Ridge did not need the biggest trees. It needed the right amount of water, light, stress, and restraint for an invisible system to survive." By the 8th year, White Ridge looked like a farm. The oaks had grown tall enough to cast narrow shadows. The hazelnuts formed dense rows along the lower slope. Irrigation lines ran cleanly between the trees, and the worst sections had been removed or replanted. Visitors saw an orchard. Jonah still saw a question. There had been no truffles. Each season, he checked root samples, adjusted water, and opened the canopies. The strongest blocks continued to show the desired fungal relationship, but nothing marketable had appeared beneath the soil. That delay changed the way people talked about him. The laughter became quieter, but the doubt became more serious. Walter no longer joked about Jonah growing rocks. Instead, he asked the question everyone else was thinking: How many years do you give it before you admit it did not work? Jonah did not have an answer. The trees were healthy. The root tests remained promising. The soil conditions still matched the plan. But a system could appear correct and still never produce. That was the risk Jonah had accepted from the beginning. He began searching for signs that did not depend on harvest. Around several mature oaks, grass had started thinning into rough circles. The areas were irregular, with weaker vegetation near the trunks and healthier growth beyond them. Samuel called the pattern encouraging, but warned him not to treat it as proof. Some truffle orchards develop a burned-looking zone around productive trees, he said, but many other things can suppress grass. So it means something? It means you should keep watching. Jonah marked every circle on the orchard map. He compared them with root tests, irrigation records, and soil depth. The strongest patterns appeared in the oldest section, where the limestone lay close enough to influence the soil, but deep enough for roots to spread. That section had also received the least intervention. Jonah had watered it carefully, added almost no fertilizer, and allowed the trees to grow slowly. The pattern suggested that restraint had mattered more than force. Still, there was no harvest. During the 9th year, Jonah hired a specialist to inspect the orchard. Dr. Elena Moreau had worked with experimental truffle plantings in several regions. She spent 2 days walking the rows, examining roots and measuring soil conditions. At the end of the visit, Jonah waited for a verdict. The orchard is viable, she said. Does that mean it will produce? No. Jonah looked away. Elena continued. It means your strongest blocks still have the right host trees, suitable soil chemistry, and active colonization. You have not wasted the entire project. That is not the same as success. No. But failure would be easier to identify. She pointed toward the oldest oak block. If production begins, I would expect it there first. When? She shook her head. No honest person can give you that date. Jonah paid her and returned to the orchard. The uncertainty had become heavier with each passing year. In the beginning, patience felt like commitment. Now it felt like exposure. Every season without a harvest gave Walter's original criticism more weight. Jonah considered cutting part of the orchard and using the lower slope for a simpler crop. Instead, he reduced the project again. He stopped expanding. No more new blocks. No more expensive improvements. The orchard would now have to prove itself using what had already been built. He focused only on maintenance. Water where needed. Prune for light. Control competing vegetation near the trees. Protect the strongest root zones. Then wait. By the 10th autumn, White Ridge had produced nothing that could justify its cost. The trees were beautiful. But beauty was not the goal. The soil was healthier. But soil improvement alone would not repay the years. One evening, Walter stood beside Jonah at the fence. You know, I was wrong about the land being useless, Walter said. Jonah looked at him. Walter continued. The orchard grows. The trees are healthy. But maybe the truffles were too much to ask. It was the kindest thing Walter had ever said about the project. That made it harder to dismiss. Jonah looked toward the oldest rows. Maybe. Walter waited for him to say more. Jonah did not. After Walter left, Jonah walked beneath the oaks until he reached the largest bare circle in the orchard. The grass there had thinned further during the season. The soil was loose near the surface and carried a faint, earthy smell after rain. Jonah knelt and pressed his fingers into it. Nothing was visible. That had always been the problem. The orchard's most important changes happened out of sight. The roots, fungi, and possible harvest could not be judged from the canopy alone. He stood and looked down the road. For 10 years, White Ridge had asked him to keep working, without the reward that would prove the work had meaning. Now the system had reached the point where effort could no longer create certainty. Only time could answer. Jonah opened his notebook and wrote, "There comes a year when patience stops feeling brave and starts feeling foolish. That is usually the year before the truth appears. The first real sign appeared in early autumn. Jonah found it beneath one of the oldest oaks, inside the largest bare circle in the orchard. The grass there had thinned for several seasons, but this year the pattern was clearer. The ground looked almost burned, compared with the vegetation beyond the canopy. He knelt and removed a small amount of soil. Nothing unusual appeared. No mushroom, no visible free, only fine roots, pale fungal threads and loose earth. Jonah marked the spot and called Dr. Elena Moral. She arrived 2 days later. Elena examined the roots, checked moisture, and took several samples from the bare zone. She was careful not to disturb more soil than necessary. The fungal relationship is still active here, she said. Jonah waited, and the vegetation pattern is consistent with what we sometimes see in productive truffle orchards. Sometimes it is not proof. Jonah looked at the empty ground. After 10 years, even encouraging news came with a warning. Elena pointed toward the surrounding trees. This is your oldest block. The soil chemistry is stable. The canopy is open enough. Moisture has been managed carefully. If truffles are forming anywhere, this is where I would search first. How? With a trained dog. Jonah had avoided that step because it felt premature. Bringing in a dog without stronger evidence would turn another private hope into a public test. But the orchard had reached the point where waiting alone no longer made sense. Elena contacted a handler named Grace Bell, who worked with scent-trained dogs. Grace arrived the following week with a brown spaniel named Moss. Walter Shaw saw the unfamiliar truck and walked over from the neighboring farm. "What is the dog for?" he asked. Jonah answered without looking at him. "To search." Walter understood immediately. Word traveled quickly. By the time Grace entered the orchard, several people had gathered near the fence. Jonah wanted to send them away, but he knew that would only make the moment larger. Moss began at the lower rows. The dog moved slowly, nose close to the ground. Grace guided him between the trees, allowing him to investigate each root zone. He passed the first row without stopping, then the second, then the third. Jonah followed several yards behind. Every missed tree felt heavier than the one before it. By the time they reached the center of the orchard, Moss had shown interest in several places, but had not given the trained signal. Grace remained calm. "A dog can notice many underground smells," she said. "Roots, animals, decaying material. We are looking for a specific response." They continued toward the oldest block. Walter stood near the fence with his hands in his pockets. He said nothing. Moss entered the first bare circle and sniffed around the trunk. He paused, then moved on. Jonah felt the hope leave him. The second circle produced the same result. At the third oak, Moss stopped. He returned to one spot near the outer edge of the canopy and pressed his nose against the soil. Grace gave a quiet command. The dog scratched once, then sat. No one moved. Grace knelt and marked the location with a small flag. "That is the signal," she said. Jonah stared at the ground. "Are you sure?" "She is trained to recognize mature scent, but we still dig carefully." Grace used a narrow tool to loosen the soil. Jonah crouched beside her and removed the earth by hand. They reached several roots. Then Grace touched something firm. Jonah brushed away the remaining soil. A dark, irregular object sat between the roots. It was smaller than his fist and coated in dirt. For a moment, it looked like a stone. Grace lifted it carefully and smelled the surface. Her expression changed. Jonah already knew. After 10 years, the first harvest from White Ridge fit inside one hand. It was not perfect. It was small, rough, and partly damaged by insects. But it was a truffle. Walter stepped closer. "That came from here?" Jonah looked at him, from under the rocks. No one laughed. Grace let Moss continue searching. Before sunset, the dog marked 2 more places. One held nothing mature enough to remove. The other produced a second, smaller truffle. The total harvest was not enough to build a business. It was enough to change everything. The root tests had suggested the system was alive. The bare circles had suggested it might be progressing. Now the ground had produced physical proof. Elena later confirmed the specimen and warned Jonah not to expect every tree to become productive. Some areas might never yield. Other truffles could take longer to mature. Jonah understood. He no longer needed the orchard to promise abundance. It had answered the only question that mattered. The system could work. That evening, after everyone left, Jonah returned to the oldest oak. The small hole had been filled. Nothing on the surface showed what had been removed. For years, people had judged White Ridge by what they could see. Thin soil, white stone, sparse grass, small trees. They had missed the roots, the fungal network, and the crop forming in darkness. Jonah opened his notebook and wrote, "The first proof did not rise from the soil. It waited beneath it until the land was ready to be believed." The first truffle changed how people saw White Ridge. For years, the orchard had produced nothing visible. Now chefs, buyers, and curious farmers began calling Jonah. The harvest was still small. Grace and Moss returned several times that season, searching only the oldest blocks. Some trees produced nothing. Others gave 1 or 2 truffles. The total crop fit into a few wooden boxes. But each box was worth more than Jonah expected. A chef from the city drove to White Ridge to inspect the harvest himself. He cared about freshness, aroma, and how quickly the truffles could reach his kitchen. Jonah agreed to sell directly. He did not need a truckload. He needed quality. That was when the economics of the land changed. Walter's farm produced far more food by weight. His wheat, hay, and cattle moved in large quantities. White Ridge could never compete with that volume. It did not have to. A small underground harvest from the right acre could generate more income than several acres of ordinary crops. Jonah remained careful. He refused to claim every tree would produce. He kept records of which oaks yielded, how much rain had fallen, and where soil conditions stayed most stable. The productive area was smaller than he once hoped. It was also more valuable. The following year, Jonah added a limited number of direct buyers. He sold to restaurants, offered a few private orchard visits, and worked with Samuel to supply properly inoculated young trees to growers who understood the risk. He warned each buyer, limestone is not enough. Oak trees are not enough. A truffle orchard is a system, not a shortcut. Some listened. Others only heard the prices. Jonah refused to sell them trees. By the third harvest season, White Ridge had developed a reputation. Buyers reserved part of the crop before it emerged. Grace's dog became a familiar sight between the rows. The once empty hillside now supported income from truffles, nursery stock, and small guided searches. The bank called again. This time, Martin Hale did not ask whether the orchard had revenue. He asked whether Jonah wanted financing to expand. Jonah agreed to discuss it, but only on his terms. He would not plant the entire property. The northern limestone band had proven itself. Other sections had not. The lower slope remained unsuitable for the same system. So Jonah used it for support crops, access and water storage. The highest ground stayed partly wild to reduce erosion and protect the orchard. He had learned that forcing every acre to produce could lower the value of the whole farm. Walter visited during the next harvest. He watched Moss stop beneath an oak and signal. Grace uncovered a mature truffle and placed it in Jonah's hand. Walter looked at the small object. That is all? This one is. And someone pays that much for it? They pay for what it is, not how much space it takes. Walter looked across the orchard. I still grow more in one field than you do on this entire ridge. You do. But your land may earn more. Jonah nodded. That was the reversal no one had expected. White Ridge had not become valuable by defeating the valley farms at their own game. It had become valuable by producing something those farms were not built to produce. The stones still covered the ground. The soil was still thin. Water still required careful management. Nothing fundamental about the ridge had changed. Only the system had. Years earlier, Everyone had looked at the hillside and asked how much wheat it could produce. The answer was almost none. Now buyers asked how many mature truffles the oldest blocks might yield. That question gave the same land an entirely different value. At the end of the season, Jonah reviewed his records. The harvest was uneven. Several productive trees gave nothing that year. A newer block still had not produced at all. Weather continued to influence quality and timing, but the orchard had crossed an important line. It was no longer an experiment supported only by patience. It was a working farm with a rare crop, established buyers, and a system that could not be recreated quickly. Jonah opened his notebook and wrote, "The land became valuable when the harvest was measured by rarity, not volume." The second appraisal began at the same gate where people had once laughed at Jonah. This time, the appraiser did not arrive to measure what White Ridge could grow in a normal season. He came to assess what the land had become after years of work. He walked the productive blocks first. Jonah showed him the oldest oaks, the irrigation zones, the harvest records and the contracts with restaurant buyers. He explained which sections produced truffles, which sections remained uncertain, and which parts of the property would never support the same system. The appraiser also counted the orchard's less visible assets. The trees were mature. The fungal relationships had been established over years. The productive soil zones had been mapped and managed carefully. The buyer network already existed. None of those things could be recreated quickly on another hillside. Walter's farm still produced more food, more weight, and more total volume. But White Ridge generated far more income from each productive acre. That difference changed the final number. When Jonah received the appraisal, he read it twice. The property was now valued above every neighboring farm of similar size, not because the soil had become deeper, not because the stones had disappeared, not because every acre was productive. Its value came from rarity, established biological systems, proven harvests, and buyers willing to pay for a crop that could not be produced on ordinary farmland. The news spread through the county within days. A regional investor visited Jonah with an offer large enough to make the original purchase price look meaningless. He wanted the entire property, the orchard records, and the White Ridge name. Jonah declined. The investor increased the offer. Jonah declined again. Walter came by that evening. "You could sell and never work another season," he said. "I know." "Then why not?" Jonah looked toward the northern slope. "Because the price includes years that cannot be bought back." The orchard was not simply land with trees on it. It was a system built through failed plantings, lost blocks, root tests, drought, pruning, and restraint. A new owner could buy the property. He could not purchase the experience that had taught Jonah how to keep it alive. Walter leaned against the fence. "My lower farm has better soil than this." "For wheat?" "Yes." "And more water?" "Yes." "Still worth less." Jonah nodded. Walter looked across the pale stones between the trees. "We were measuring the wrong thing." That was the truth behind the appraisal. For years, everyone had measured White Ridge by conventional yield. Once the land was judged by the value of its actual system, the numbers changed completely. The bank soon offered Jonah more credit than he had ever requested. He accepted only enough to improve storage, protect harvested truffles, and replace aging irrigation lines. He refused to expand into unsuitable ground. More trees did not guarantee more value. Poor expansion could weaken the orchard and damage the reputation he had built. At the next county agricultural meeting, Jonah spoke to a room full of farmers and landowners. He did not tell them to plant truffles. He told them to stop assuming that low conventional yield meant low potential. "Some land is truly limited," he said. "Some is damaged. Some may never return the money required to restore it. But sometimes the problem is not the land. It is the standard being used to judge it." After the meeting, several farmers asked him to inspect their properties. Jonah refused to promise hidden fortunes. Most land would not support what White Ridge supported. Even similar limestone ground might fail because of climate, drainage, tree health, or competing fungi. What worked here depended on a rare combination. That was exactly why it had become valuable. When Jonah returned home, the evening light reflected off the white stones scattered between the rows. They had not changed since the day he bought the ridge. Years earlier, they had been treated as proof that the land was useless. Now they were part of the explanation for why it was worth more than the farms below. Jonah opened his notebook and wrote, "The second appraisal did not discover the land's value. It finally measured the value that patience had built there." White Ridge became known far beyond Bellwether County. Chefs visited during harvest season. Agricultural groups came to study the orchard. Landowners asked Jonah whether their own stony fields might support a similar system. He gave everyone the same answer: maybe. But matching the land matters more than copying the crop. The warning disappointed people who wanted a simple formula. They saw the value of the truffles, but not the years of failed trees. Altered irrigation, lost blocks, and careful soil testing behind them. Jonah refused to sell the story as easy wealth. Some sections of White Ridge still produced nothing. A few trees yielded one season and remained silent the next. Weather affected quality. Animal damage reduced part of one harvest. Competing fungi appeared in another block. The farm remained valuable because Jonah protected what had already worked. He did not chase growth for its own sake. When the county proposed widening the road near the lower boundary, Jonah objected. Construction could alter drainage and send runoff toward the productive slope. Years earlier, officials would have dismissed concerns about marginal land. Now engineers visited the property, reviewed his maps, and adjusted the plan. The same ridge, once considered nearly worthless, was now treated as an agricultural asset worth protecting. Walter noticed the irony. "They would not have moved a fence post for this place when you bought it," he said. "They saw empty ground. And now they see revenue." Walter looked toward the orchard. "You saw something before the money?" Jonah shook his head. "I saw questions before the money." That distinction mattered. He had never known White Ridge would succeed. He had only recognized that the land's failures did not explain its full potential. Over time, Walter began managing one of his rocky boundary fields differently. He did not plant truffles. The soil and slope were not suitable. Instead, he established drought-tolerant forage and used the area for controlled grazing. It became modestly profitable. One evening, he told Jonah, "Turns out bad wheat ground can still be good ground for something else." Jonah smiled. That lesson spread further than the orchard itself. Farmers began testing marginal corners separately instead of blending them into one average. Some planted trees. Others restored grazing areas or built pollinator habitat. A few discovered no profitable use and stopped wasting money trying to force a crop there. Not every failed field hid a fortune, but many had been judged too quickly. White Ridge remained the strongest example. Its productive acres generated more value than nearby farms several times their size. The orchard had established buyers, a trusted name, and a biological system that had taken years to mature. The land's worth no longer depended only on soil depth or traditional yield. It included time, knowledge, rarity, and the difficulty of rebuilding the same system elsewhere. Near the end of one harvest season, Walter joined Jonah beneath the oldest oak. Grace's dog had marked the area earlier that morning. Jonah carefully lifted a mature truffle from the soil and brushed away the dirt. Walter watched quietly. "I remember telling you nothing would grow here," he said. Jonah held up the truffle. "Technically, you were looking in the wrong direction." Walter laughed. It was the first time they had laughed together about White Ridge. They stood beneath the oak while the evening sun reached across the pale stones. The hillside still looked difficult. It still lacked the deep, dark soil farmers admired. But no one in Bellwether County called it useless anymore. The land had not defeated the better farms nearby. It had simply become valuable in a way they could not imitate. Jonah returned the truffle to its wooden box and looked down the curved rows. Years earlier, people had measured White Ridge by everything it lacked. Now they measured it by what could only exist there. And that had made all the difference. Jonah never sold White Ridge. He received larger offers each year, but the numbers no longer impressed him the way they once would have. The land had become valuable because the orchard was mature. The buyers trusted the harvest, and the system had survived long enough to prove itself. Selling would have turned all of that into money. Keeping it allowed the value to continue growing. Jonah expanded carefully, but he never planted the entire property. The northern limestone band remained the center of production. The lower ground supported water storage, access, and supporting plants. The highest sections stayed partly wild. Some visitors thought this was wasteful. They saw empty acres and asked why Jonah did not plant more trees. Because not every acre is asking for the same job, he told them. That answer had become the central lesson of White Ridge. The farm was not valuable because every part produced a high-value crop. It was valuable because each part protected the system that did. The wild ground reduced erosion. The lower slope helped manage water. The mature trees supported the fungal network. The productive blocks created the harvest. Nothing worked alone. Jonah also refused to present truffle farming as a guaranteed path to wealth. At workshops, he showed photographs of dead trees, failed root samples, and the block he had removed after years of work. He explained that limestone, alkaline soil, and oak trees were only starting conditions. A grower still needed the right climate, planting material, water management, timing, and market. Even then, failure remained possible. That honesty made people trust him more. White Ridge's story spread because it sounded like a miracle from a distance. Up close, it was a long sequence of observations, corrections, and losses. The land had not suddenly become valuable. Jonah had spent years discovering what kind of value it could support. Walter Shaw understood that better than anyone. One afternoon, he joined Jonah at the top of the ridge. Below them, Walter's fields stretched across the valley in broad green rows. White Ridge looked smaller, rougher, and less productive by conventional standards, yet the latest appraisal valued Jonah's property above every nearby farm of similar size. Walter looked down at his own land. I used to think better soil always meant better land. For what you grow, it still does, Jonah said, but not for everything. No. Walter pointed toward the orchard. You could not grow my wheat up here, and you could not rebuild this orchard quickly in your field. The difference was not superiority. It was fit. Walter's land excelled at volume. Jonah's land excelled at rarity. Each farm became valuable by doing what its conditions allowed best. That was the final truth White Ridge revealed. Land did not have one universal value. Its value depended on the relationship between soil, crop, knowledge, time, and market. The county had once looked at the ridge and seen only limitations. Thin soil, white stone, poor water retention, low conventional yield. All of those facts were true, but they were incomplete. The same limestone that limited wheat helped create alkaline conditions. The same slope that made machinery difficult improved drainage. The same oaks that seemed useless became host trees. The same years without visible harvest allowed an underground biological system to mature. The weaknesses had not disappeared. They had been placed inside a system where they could become useful. Near the end of the season, Jonah walked alone through the oldest block. The ground beneath the trees was quiet. The harvest had finished. Grace and moss had already left, and the final boxes were on their way to buyers. Jonah stopped beside the first oak he had planted. Its trunk was thick now. Its roots extended far beyond the small circle he had watered by hand during the first summer. He remembered the day Walter laughed at the crooked rows. He remembered selling his tractor. He remembered removing healthy trees because the underground system was failing. He remembered the years when nothing came out of the soil. At the time, each loss had felt like evidence that White Ridge had defeated him. Now he understood those losses had shaped the orchard as much as the successes. They had forced him to become precise, to expand slowly, to stop confusing growth with value. Jonah opened the old notebook he still carried. The first pages contained sketches of rocks, oak trees and failed soil samples. Later pages recorded irrigation changes, root tests, and the locations of the first productive trees. On the final blank page, he wrote, "They said nothing would grow here because they were searching for the kind of harvest they already understood." He paused, then added, "The land became more valuable than every farm nearby when it was finally allowed to produce something only it could support." Jonah closed the notebook and looked across White Ridge. The stones still shone in the evening light. The soil was still thin. The hill was still difficult. Nothing essential about the land had changed. What changed was the way it was read, and that was what made it valuable.